The Panzer IV wasn't flashy like the Tiger tank. It didn't get posters or fame, but it was the backbone of Nazi Germany's tank force. From Africa's burning deserts to Russia's frozen nightmare, it was everywhere. And inside those steel boxes, 5 young men living, sweating, and sometimes dying together. But the Panzer IV was never supposed to be a frontline warrior. It was made to support the fight, not lead it. Yet as the war turned brutal, this tank and its crew were thrown into battles they weren't built for, and the consequences were horrifying. Germany started building the Panzer IV in secret. It was 1934, and they were still under the Treaty of Versailles, so they didn't call it a tank, they called it a medium tractor. But everyone knew what it really was. The early Panzer IV was simple. Its gun was short and stubby, only meant to blast buildings or infantry. It had just 15 millimeters of armor on the front, barely more than a tin can. However, it was inexpensive, easy to construct, and easy to repair. That made it perfect for mass production. At first, the Panzer IV worked well. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, it had just over 200 of them. These tanks supported the others by shooting high explosive shells, and they did their job, fast and loud. But they weren't made to fight other tanks, and that would become a big problem. But as the war spread across continents, the Panzer IV's job and its crew's nightmare was about to change. As war rolled into France and Russia, the enemies got tougher, and the Panzer IV couldn't keep up. German soldiers and Panzer IVs started running into French B-1 tanks and Soviet monsters like the T-34 and KV-1. Their thin armor couldn't protect them, and their low-power gun, it barely scratched enemy tanks. Suddenly, crews trained for support missions were told, "You're tank killers now." They hadn't signed up for this. Their machines weren't ready, but orders were orders. So Hitler made a move. He pushed for an upgrade, a long-barreled, high-speed, 75mm gun. It gave the Panzer IV more punch, finally letting it fight toe-to-toe with enemy tanks. This version was called the F2, but it came at a cost. More firepower meant more responsibility, and that responsibility crushed the crews inside. Before, Panzer IV crews were just support. Now, they were hunters. Their tank was turned into Germany's main battle tank. The 5-man crew had to learn fast. Their new job? Take on Soviet heavy tanks, American Shermans, and British Churchills. And those tanks were coming in waves. The gunners now had high-velocity cannons, but hitting a fast-moving target while being shot at? That wasn't easy. And the pressure was brutal. One wrong move and the tank exploded. These weren't slow battles. Fights happened fast, often within seconds. The inside of a tank was chaos. Orders being shouted, ammo being loaded, the gunner trying to aim, the driver dodging enemy fire. You didn't have time to think. You just acted, or you died. But it wasn't just the enemy they had to fear. Their own tank became a deadly trap. Here's one of the worst truths. The Panzer IV was a coffin on tracks. Why? The ammunition was stored all over the tank, next to the crew, in the sidewalls, in the floor. If a shell hit just right, it would light everything up. The ammo exploded. Fire raced through the tank in seconds. Many crew members didn't even make it out. The German soldiers had a dark joke for this. When a tank got hit and burst into flames, they called it brewing up. It sounds funny until you realize what it means. These were young men, 18, 19 years old, trapped in metal ovens with flames racing around them. No escape, no hope. Statistically, once a Panzer IV got hit, it was often game over. It didn't matter how tough the armor was. The insides were packed with fuel, explosives, and human beings. And if the tank didn't kill them, the battlefield outside wasn't any kinder. The Panzer IV went everywhere. North Africa, France, the Eastern Front, but every place brought a different kind of suffering. In Africa, it was heat. The desert sun turned tanks into ovens. Inside temperatures hit 50 degrees Celsius. The metal was so hot, it burned bare skin. Crews were soaked in sweat, surrounded by bullets and each other's body odor. They fought while baking inside their own armor. Then came Russia. Now, the tanks froze. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. The oil in the engine turned to jelly. Crews had to light fires under the tank just to get it moving. If that didn't work, they'd crank it by hand, out in the snow, shaking with frostbite. The inside of the tank was no safer. Crews breathed gasoline fumes to stay warm. They slept inside, coughing, freezing, praying not to die before morning. One small crack in the engine or tracks, and the tank would be stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by Soviet troops. And escape wasn't always possible. But as the war dragged on, even surviving a battle wasn't enough. The nightmare was far from over. By 1943, the Germans had something better, the Panther. It was designed from the ground up to fight enemy tanks. Sloped armor, a powerful gun. It should have replaced the Panzer IV, but it didn't. The Panther was rushed into production. It broke down constantly. So the old Panzer IV, meant for support roles, had to stay in the fight. Upgrades were rushed. More armor was slapped on. Side skirts were added to stop anti-tank rifles and bazookas. The gun was lengthened again. Now it could take on Shermans at over 1,000 meters. But the weight kept going up. What started as a 16-ton tank was now over 25 tons. The engine wasn't made for that. Parts wore out fast. Crews didn't care. It was still the best chance they had. But even with all the upgrades, the biggest threat wasn't what was outside the tank. It was what was happening inside Germany. By the final years of the war, Germany was falling apart. Bombs hit factories, supplies were drying up, and tank crews paid the price. Late-model Panzer IVs were built with whatever was left. Paint ran out, so only half the tank was painted white. Rubber was gone. Road wheels were now all steel, making the tank squeal as it moved. Turrets no longer had motors, they had to be turned by hand. A full 360-degree spin took at least a minute, too slow to survive a real fight. Worse, fuel tanks were shoved inside the crew compartment to increase range. One shot in the wrong spot, and the whole tank exploded. Armor became brittle. Intercoms were missing. Some tanks didn't even have working radios. Crews were fighting blind and nearly death. Even the training collapsed. Before, it took 16 weeks to train a crew. Now, it was 4 or less. Some soldiers went to battle after just 3 weeks of driving practice. Many couldn't even handle the tank's delicate gearbox. The result? Mechanical failures in the middle of battle. They didn't stand a chance. But the worst wasn't the tank. It was knowing your own time was running out. By the end, Panzer IV crews were running on fear. On the Eastern Front, the average life expectancy of a crewman was 2 weeks. The Eastern battles were pure horror. Soviet tanks came in waves, artillery pounded them, planes hunted them, infantry swarmed with anti-tank weapons. There was nowhere to hide. Sometimes the tanks broke down. Crews had to destroy their own machines before retreating, pouring sand into the engine, blowing out the barrel, making sure no one else could use it again. Even when they won a fight, they knew it didn't matter. Another one was coming. More enemies, less fuel, fewer parts, no rest. When Panzer IVs couldn't move anymore, they were dug into the ground and used as bunkers. The tank that once led the charge now sat in place, waiting to be destroyed. And yet, some crews fought on. With frozen hands, broken gear, and no sleep, they stayed inside those steel boxes, doing their job because they had no other choice. The Panzer IV wasn't just a tank. It was a prison on tracks. It burned in the desert. It froze in the snow. It broke down. It exploded. It got upgraded, reused, and pushed past its limit. Over 8,500 were built. Most were destroyed. Only 29 survive in museums today. And when you stand in front of one, remember, it wasn't just metal. It held 5 young men inside. 5 lives crammed into a tiny space. 5 stories of hope, fear, and sometimes fire. Inside those steel walls, they didn't just fight a war, they lived it. And far too often, they died with it.